Emily Bennett thought she was testing her husband's loyalty, but when her best friend Sophie became part of the plan, what began as suspicion turned into betrayal and ended in death. Emily Bennett had always believed she knew her husband better than anyone else. Their life together seemed almost too perfect, built on 7 years of shared routines, quiet mornings, and promises whispered over time. She was the kind of woman who paid attention to every detail, the way Daniel's shirt collars were always pressed, the faint cologne he wore, the exact moment his car pulled into the driveway each evening. But lately those familiar details started to feel wrong. Daniel's schedule had changed. His gym hours stretched later into the night. He returned home distracted, his phone clutched tightly, and sometimes she noticed him smiling at messages he wouldn't show her. The small cracks that once seemed harmless began to grow until they felt like fractures she could no longer ignore. She tried to silence the doubts by reminding herself how loyal Daniel had always been. He was charming, yes, but also responsible and proud of his marriage. Still, the uncertainty crept in when she found faint traces of perfume on his clothes, not hers, not a scent she recognized. There were missed calls from clients she had never heard of, and new gym members whose names Daniel didn't mention. Emily's thoughts became a constant storm of suspicion and denial, swinging between fear and hope. She started watching him more closely, noticing things she had ignored for years. Every late text, every unexplained delay became a puzzle piece she couldn't fit together. One night, unable to sleep, she sat on the edge of their bed staring at Daniel's reflection in the mirror as he slept. His calm breathing enraged her. He looked peaceful while she was consumed with turmoil. The idea that he could be hiding something worse, hiding someone, ate away at her reason. That was when an idea began to form in her mind, something she'd seen online before but never imagined she'd consider. A loyalty test. She would use someone she trusted, someone who could act naturally around Daniel, to see if he'd take the bait. She told herself it wasn't cruel, it was necessary. If he passed, she'd finally have peace. If he failed, she'd have the truth. Her thoughts turned to Sophie Turner, her closest friend since college. Sophie had been with Emily through every major moment: breakups, job changes, the wedding itself. She was the only person Emily felt she could trust with something so dangerous. Sophie was confident, funny, and beautiful in an effortless way. People liked her instantly, including Daniel, who had always gotten along with her. Emily had noticed his occasional compliments toward Sophie, though they were always harmless. Still, it made her wonder, if temptation appeared in front of him, would he resist it? Or would his friendly nature cross a line? The next afternoon, Emily invited Sophie for coffee. She planned every word carefully, rehearsing how she would ask without sounding insane. But when the moment came, her voice trembled slightly as she explained what she wanted. Sophie stared at her in disbelief, unsure if she had heard correctly. Emily tried to justify it as a harmless test, something simple, just flirting a little to see how Daniel reacted. Sophie hesitated, clearly uncomfortable, but Emily's desperation overpowered her reluctance. She said she needed closure, that she couldn't live with doubt anymore. Eventually, Sophie agreed, not because she wanted to, but because she couldn't stand seeing Emily fall apart. That night, Emily felt lighter. For the first time in weeks, she believed she might finally get an answer. She imagined Daniel laughing off Sophie's advances, staying loyal, proving her fears wrong. The thought soothed her, though deep down she knew the risk she was taking. She told herself it was just a game, that nothing real would come of it. But when she looked at her reflection before bed, she noticed the unease in her own eyes. It wasn't excitement. It was dread. The following day, Sophie followed through with the plan. She went to Daniel's gym, pretending she wanted to start a fitness program. Emily waited anxiously, her phone clutched in her hand, heart racing every time it buzzed. She imagined the two of them in that bright, mirrored space, Sophie pretending to stretch, Daniel showing her equipment, their eyes meeting. The images in her mind twisted until she could hardly breathe. When Sophie didn't respond to her texts for hours, Emily's imagination spiraled further. By the time Sophie finally called that evening, Emily's nerves were raw. Sophie's voice was quiet, a little uncertain, saying only that the meeting had gone fine and Daniel had been perfectly professional. But something in her tone didn't sound right. There was a pause between words, a hesitation that made Emily's stomach turn. She thanked her friend and hung up, but sleep didn't come that night. She lay awake listening to the clock ticking, wondering if Sophie was hiding something. The next morning, Daniel acted normal, maybe too normal. He poured his coffee, checked his phone, and kissed her on the cheek before leaving for work. Emily watched him go, trying to read meaning into every gesture. She told herself to calm down, that she had proof of his faithfulness. But instead of peace, she felt worse. She couldn't shake the feeling that Sophie's story was incomplete, that she wasn't telling her everything. Over the next few days, Emily's thoughts darkened. She started replaying every memory she had of Daniel and Sophie together: barbecues, birthdays, the wedding reception. She remembered their laughter, how comfortable they had always been around each other. Had there always been something between them that she failed to see? She began scrolling through Sophie's social media, looking for anything suspicious. Every old photo, every comment felt like a clue. She started writing down her thoughts in a notebook, trying to make sense of them, but each page became more chaotic. Her handwriting slanted as her mind unraveled lists of times Daniel came home late, names of women he mentioned, details about Sophie's visits. She was building her own case, one that had no evidence except her fear. The more she obsessed, the more convinced she became that both of them were lying to her. A week after the test began, Emily decided she needed to see for herself. She drove to Daniel's gym one evening and parked across the street, waiting in her car as the lights flickered inside. Through the glass, she saw Daniel laughing with someone she couldn't make out who, but the sight sent her heart into her throat. When the woman turned and she saw Sophie's blonde hair, everything inside her broke. She drove home trembling, unsure whether to scream or cry. That night, Emily couldn't eat or sleep. She sat at the kitchen table in silence, staring at her phone. She wanted to call Sophie, to demand answers, but fear stopped her. Instead, she opened a new message and typed, "How was the gym today?" Then she deleted it. Again, she typed, "Did he say anything unusual?" and deleted that too. She couldn't bring herself to confront it yet. Outside, rain began to fall, tapping against the window like a slow heartbeat. Emily felt trapped between suspicion and regret. What had started as a harmless test had turned into something dangerous. She had set her friend and her husband against each other without realizing how deep it might cut. As she finally lay down in bed beside Daniel, staring into the dark, she realized that no matter what the truth was, something inside her had already changed forever. The following week passed under a tense and invisible fog that neither Emily nor Daniel could escape. Everything felt slightly off balance, their conversations shorter, their smiles forced, their dinners filled with silence heavy enough to press on Emily's chest. Daniel seemed distracted, lost in thought even when sitting across from her. He scrolled through his phone more often now, turning the screen away each time she walked past. Every movement, every pause, every breath became another piece of evidence in Emily's mind. She was unraveling and she knew it, but the pull of suspicion was stronger than her will to stop it. Sophie tried to act normal around her friend, pretending the plan had ended and that Daniel had passed the test. But Emily could see through her discomfort. There was something unsaid hiding in Sophie's eyes, something she didn't want to reveal. That silence burned through Emily like acid. Late at night, she replayed every detail Sophie had told her: the casual meeting, the harmless flirting, the polite goodbye. None of it felt real. She could sense there was more. Her instincts screamed that Sophie was holding something back. She decided to push further. The next morning, she texted Sophie and asked her to continue visiting Daniel at the gym. She framed it as a simple follow-up, one last round of testing to be absolutely sure. Sophie resisted at first, saying she didn't want to make things worse, but Emily's words were sharp and persuasive. She insisted she just needed closure. Reluctantly, Sophie agreed once more. Daniel welcomed Sophie as a client without knowing he was walking into the center of a lie. They exchanged texts about workouts, nutrition, and gym schedules. At first, it was all businesslike, but over time the tone softened. Daniel began to open up to her, not as a trainer to a client, but as a man who felt misunderstood. He confided about his growing distance from Emily, the tension at home, and how lonely he had felt lately. Sophie tried to keep the conversations professional, but she couldn't ignore the sympathy she felt. She didn't intend to cross a line. She told herself it was only emotional support, but slowly, the barrier between comfort and connection started to crumble. Emily didn't know the details yet, but her instinct sensed the shift. She began checking Sophie's social media obsessively, noticing small things, posts about long days, tired eyes, gym selfies. Every detail became suspicious. When she noticed Sophie wearing a bracelet Daniel had once given her as a gift, Emily's pulse quickened. It was supposed to be harmless, a birthday present years ago, but now it looked like a taunt. She started monitoring Daniel more closely. His gym bag had new clothes she didn't recognize, his cologne changed, and his tone became softer when he spoke on the phone. One evening, while he showered, Emily unlocked his phone and opened his messages. There they were, texts from Sophie. Nothing explicitly incriminating, but just intimate enough to make her blood run cold. Lines about how proud she was of his work, jokes about their sessions, even the occasional heart emoji. It was all too much. Her hands shook as she read through them, scrolling faster, breathing heavier, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might break her ribs. That night, she didn't confront him. Instead, she stared at him as he slept, his face calm and unaware. The more she looked, the more she hated him for looking peaceful, while her mind tore itself apart. She imagined the worst secret meetings, whispered touches, laughter behind her back. She wanted to scream, but instead she planned. She needed to know how far it had gone, and only Sophie could tell her. The next morning, Emily drove to Sophie's apartment unannounced. She stood outside the door for several minutes, gripping her phone tightly, her pulse thudding in her ears. When Sophie opened the door, her face froze. She knew why Emily had come. Emily stepped inside, her eyes scanning the room, taking in every small detail, the scent of Daniel's cologne on a jacket draped over a chair, the faint trace of men's shoes by the door. Her stomach twisted. She asked no questions. She just stared at Sophie until the silence became unbearable. Sophie, cornered, admitted that Daniel had been open with her emotionally, but swore that nothing physical had happened. She said she had tried to end the friendship, that it was getting too close, but Daniel insisted they were just friends. Emily didn't believe her. Every word sounded like a cover-up, a script written to ease guilt. She left without saying a word, her heart filled with a cold fury she couldn't contain. Driving home, she felt the world blur around her. The streets, the lights, the sound of the tires, all of it disappeared beneath the noise inside her head. She felt betrayed by both of them. Over the next days, Emily's mind became consumed by thoughts of revenge. She imagined exposing them publicly, sending screenshots to their friends, showing the world what they'd done. She even considered showing up at Daniel's gym to confront them both. But every time she thought of acting, her fear of being wrong pulled her back. What if Sophie was telling the truth? What if Daniel hadn't actually cheated? The uncertainty made her sick. Daniel noticed her distance but couldn't understand it. He tried to make conversation, offered to take her out to dinner, even planned a short weekend getaway. But Emily saw these gestures as manipulation, attempts to distract her from the truth. She smiled just enough to keep him unsuspecting while secretly checking his messages every night after he fell asleep. One evening, she discovered a call history that confirmed her worst fear. Daniel had spoken to Sophie for nearly an hour late at night after he claimed to be working on gym paperwork. That was enough. The evidence didn't need to be explicit anymore. It was betrayal, plain and simple. Emily didn't confront either of them right away. She wanted to make them feel the same anxiety that had eaten away at her for weeks. She began sending cryptic messages from an unknown number to Sophie, warnings, hints that someone was watching. Sophie grew terrified, certain that someone was following her. Meanwhile, Daniel became restless, sensing Emily's coldness but unable to identify the cause. When Emily finally reached her breaking point, she devised one last move. She told Sophie to meet Daniel one final time, saying she wanted complete closure. Sophie tried to refuse, but Emily's voice over the phone was trembling and insistent. Sophie reluctantly agreed, knowing deep down it was a mistake. That final meeting took place late one evening at the gym. Sophie intended to make it clear that they couldn't talk anymore, that it was wrong, that it was hurting everyone. But Daniel misread her tension as guilt and tried to comfort her. What happened next was captured faintly on the gym's security camera, Sophie crying, Daniel stepping closer, a brief embrace, then the feed cutting out. When Emily later saw the partial footage through a source she refused to reveal, her mind shattered completely. The image of Daniel's arms around Sophie burned into her thoughts, looping endlessly like a cruel film she couldn't stop watching. To her, it wasn't comfort. It was proof. Proof that both had betrayed her, that love had turned into humiliation. That night, Emily's silence filled the house like a storm waiting to break. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She simply stared at the wall, numb, as if all the air had been drained from the room. What had started as a test of loyalty had become a trap that swallowed everyone in it. And in that quiet, suffocating moment, something inside her crossed a line she could never uncross. The days following the final gym meeting were eerily quiet. Yet beneath the calm, Emily's emotions had become a violent storm. Every sound seemed to echo inside her skull, every tick of the clock scraping against her nerves. Daniel went about his routines as if nothing had changed, but Emily watched him like a predator waiting for a moment of weakness. The image of him holding Sophie in that grainy gym footage replayed endlessly in her mind. She no longer cared about context, explanations, or intent. That single embrace was all the proof she needed. It was betrayal, intimate, unforgivable, and irreversible. She stopped eating properly and barely slept. Her face grew pale, her eyes hollow, her thoughts consumed by an endless loop of anger and disbelief. During the day, she functioned automatically answering emails, cleaning the kitchen, pretending to live normally. But inside, her heart was disintegrating. Each passing hour added fuel to her rage. She wondered if they were still meeting, if they laughed about her behind her back, if Sophie had been lying to her from the start. The pain turned poisonous. She wanted them to feel it too, to understand what she had been forced to endure. One afternoon, Emily found Daniel's laptop sitting open on the dining table. He had gone for a jog, leaving it unattended for the first time in weeks. Her hands trembled as she hovered over the touchpad, unsure if she wanted to know more or if the truth would destroy her completely. Curiosity and fury pushed her forward. She opened his files, scanning through folders until she found one labeled Client Records. At first, it seemed harmless photos of gym members, fitness plans, training videos. But then she saw another folder, hidden inside, marked Private. The name itself felt like an invitation and a threat. She clicked it open. Inside were images, photos from around the gym, screenshots of social media, and one short video file. It was dated the same night Sophie had disappeared for 3 days. Emily's pulse thudded in her ears as she pressed play. The video began innocently enough. Daniel closing up the gym, turning off lights, locking doors. Then Sophie appeared, walking toward him, speaking nervously, her hands shaking slightly. The camera caught their conversation from a distance, the audio faint and muffled. They sat down on a bench, and Daniel reached for her hand. Emily felt her chest tighten. Sophie leaned into him, crying. Then, as if something in the air broke, Daniel pulled her closer. Their bodies pressed together in what looked like an embrace, long, desperate, and filled with meaning Emily could no longer rationalize. The video cut off abruptly, leaving her staring at a frozen frame of them in each other's arms. Her breathing quickened, the room spun. She felt nauseated, but the rage overpowered her sickness. That single image burned into her mind like a scar. She no longer cared about explanations. The story was complete in her head. Sophie had betrayed her, Daniel had chosen her friend, and she had been made the fool. That evening, Emily confronted Daniel without words. She placed his laptop on the table when he came home. The screen paused on the final frame of the video. Daniel froze when he saw it, his expression shifting from confusion to horror. He tried to speak, but Emily didn't move, didn't blink, didn't give him the satisfaction of a reaction. The silence between them was sharper than any argument could ever be. When he reached toward her, she stepped back and left the room, her eyes cold and empty. The next morning, she drove to Sophie's apartment. The sky was gray, the streets damp from an overnight drizzle. She parked across the road and sat there for nearly 20 minutes, gripping the steering wheel until her knuckles turned white. She rehearsed what she would say, how she would make Sophie admit everything. But when she finally stepped out of the car, her anger no longer felt like fire. Neighbors later recalled seeing her enter the building around noon. The security cameras showed her walking calmly up the stairs, her expression unreadable. No one saw what happened next inside that apartment. The sounds were faint, an argument muffled through walls, then something breaking, then silence. When Sophie's neighbor knocked to check, there was no response. By the time police arrived hours later, Sophie was lying on the living room floor, unconscious, her head bleeding from a heavy blow. A shattered glass vase lay beside her. She was rushed to the hospital in critical condition. Emily was gone. Her phone had been left behind, her car missing. The news spread quickly through their neighborhood. Daniel was questioned immediately but denied any involvement. He looked broken, unable to understand how things had spiraled this far. He admitted that Sophie had come to him for comfort, that he had held her because she was crying, but insisted that nothing romantic had ever happened. His words meant nothing now. Both women's lives were shattered, and he stood at the center of the wreckage. Investigators tracked Emily's car through traffic cameras. She drove aimlessly for hours, stopping at random places, a park bench, a quiet street corner, a gas station. Witnesses described her as calm but distant, like someone moving through a dream. By nightfall, her car was found parked near Lake Alder, the doors unlocked, her purse on the passenger seat. Search teams began combing the area early the next morning. The shoreline was muddy and cold, the wind cutting through the silence. It took them 2 days to find her body floating near the reeds, pale and still. The autopsy later confirmed drowning, though there were no signs of struggle. It wasn't clear whether she had jumped intentionally or slipped while walking along the edge. Her final hours remained a mystery. When police examined the car, they found a piece of paper wedged between the seats. The note was handwritten, short, and chilling. She failed the test. He failed too. I have nothing left to prove. That single sentence told investigators everything and nothing at once. It was both a confession and a eulogy, a window into the torment that had consumed her. The media seized the story instantly. News anchors labeled it the loyalty test tragedy. Online forums debated endlessly about who was to blame, Emily for her obsession, Daniel for his emotional betrayal, or Sophie for agreeing to play along. People dissected the case from every angle, some calling it a story of love turned toxic, others calling it proof of how suspicion can destroy even the strongest relationships. Sophie eventually regained consciousness but suffered long-term memory gaps about what had happened that day. She told police that Emily had seemed calm but strange and that she couldn't remember the exact moment things turned violent. Her physical wounds healed, but the emotional scars never did. She withdrew from everyone, unable to face the whispers, the questions, or the weight of guilt she couldn't explain. Daniel sold his gym soon after Emily's funeral. He couldn't bear to walk into that place again. The sight of the equipment, the smell of disinfectant, the sound of weights clanging it all reminded him of the video, of the moment that had set everything in motion. He stopped answering calls, disconnected from friends, and moved to another state. For months, people continued to speculate, searching for meaning in the chaos. Some said Emily's death was a desperate act of guilt after attacking her friend. Others believed it was deliberate revenge followed by remorse. But the truth was simpler and darker. It was a chain reaction born from doubt, a single spark of insecurity that grew into obsession, deception, and ultimately death. In the end, there were no winners. Sophie lived with guilt, Daniel with regret, and Emily's name became a tragic reminder whispered across news reports and crime documentaries. The test she created to find reassurance had revealed a far crueler truth. Sometimes, trust is senti lost in a single betrayal, it erodes piece by piece until there's nothing left to hold on to. Detectives assigned to the case spent weeks piecing together the fragments of what had happened, trying to reconstruct the final days of Emily Bennett's life. From the outside, it appeared straightforward: a marriage destroyed by suspicion, a friendship poisoned by deceit, and a woman driven beyond the edge. But as investigators dug deeper, they realized there were layers of confusion, conflicting stories and evidence that didn't quite fit. Emily's death was ruled a suicide, but the note she left behind suggested something more complicated: an emotional storm that had pulled everyone into its eye. Daniel was questioned multiple times, but his version of events never changed. He insisted that nothing romantic had happened between him and Sophie, that he had simply comforted her during a difficult moment. To the detectives, his tone carried exhaustion rather than guilt. Yet the video Emily had found, the one showing him embracing Sophie, was enough to raise doubts in everyone's mind. It wasn't clear whether Emily had downloaded it herself or if someone had sent it to her anonymously. That uncertainty became one of many unanswered questions. When forensic teams went through Emily's car, they found more than the note. Hidden inside a notebook in the glove compartment were pages filled with chaotic handwriting lists of times, dates, and emotional reflections. Her thoughts jumped from rage to sorrow to confusion in a matter of sentences. One line, scrawled in heavy ink, stood out. "If they won't tell me the truth, I'll make them feel what I feel." That sentence chilled even the most seasoned investigators. It spoke of intent, not impulse. It suggested that Emily's meeting with Sophie had been planned long before she drove to that apartment. The apartment itself told its own story. There were signs of a struggle: an overturned chair, shattered glass, and blood on the floor near the sofa, but nothing was stolen. Nothing else was damaged. It was personal, targeted, emotional. Sophie had survived with head trauma, but her memories of that day were fragmented. She remembered letting Emily in, remembered her face looking pale and distant, and then flashes of anger, Emily shouting words she couldn't recall clearly. After that, darkness. She woke up in the hospital days later to learn that her friend was dead. The guilt that followed consumed Sophie. She replayed every moment leading up to that day, searching for the point where she could have stopped it. She had only wanted to help, to reassure Emily that Daniel wasn't cheating. But her role had blurred into something far more destructive. She had become the center of Emily's obsession without realizing it. When she saw the news reports describing Emily's body found at the lake, Sophie collapsed in tears, overcome by a sorrow that no words could explain. The story drew massive attention. Journalists turned it into a national headline, a tale of love, paranoia, and tragedy that fascinated and horrified viewers. Talk shows debated who was truly responsible. Some blamed Daniel for emotional negligence, accusing him of creating the emotional distance that made Emily spiral. Others accused Sophie of betrayal, arguing that she should have refused the loyalty test from the beginning. But beneath all the noise, one simple truth remained: 3 lives had been destroyed by the absence of trust. In the weeks after the funeral, Daniel's life disintegrated further. He stopped eating properly, barely slept, and refused to return to his gym. The once charismatic instructor now moved through his days like a ghost, haunted by memories he couldn't escape. He kept seeing Emily's face, her eyes cold and distant the last time he saw her alive. He listened to the voicemail she had left him hours before her death, a single sentence that made no sense at the time. "You don't have to lie anymore." That message became an echo in his mind, a reminder that no matter what he said or did, she had already made her decision. Friends tried to reach out, but Daniel avoided everyone. He deleted his social media accounts, sold his house, and relocated to another city, hoping anonymity would numb the pain, but it didn't. Everywhere he went, he felt like people knew. Every whisper, every glance seemed to carry the same question: was he guilty? He couldn't escape the narrative that the world had created around him, a man whose wife died because of an affair he never admitted to, whether or not it truly happened. Meanwhile, Sophie's recovery was slow and painful. Physically, her wounds healed, but mentally, she was trapped in the same loop as Daniel. She moved to a small town far away, changing her number and leaving behind her old life. Still, she couldn't escape Emily's presence. Sometimes she dreamed of her, standing by the lake, eyes blank and unblinking. Other nights, she heard Emily's voice whispering from the shadows of her mind, asking why she did it, why she agreed to the test. Sophie had no answer. Detectives eventually closed the case officially, but whispers lingered. Some officers believed Emily might have been planning something far more violent than anyone realized before she turned the harm on herself. One theory suggested that after attacking Sophie, she drove to the lake intending to stage her own disappearance, but overwhelmed by guilt, she walked into the water instead. Another theory hinted that Daniel could have followed her that night, that perhaps their final encounter ended in tragedy. But there was no evidence, no footprints, no witnesses, no trace of struggle. Just the note. Public fascination with the case never faded. Documentaries dissected every timeline, analyzing Emily's journal entries, police interviews, and the footage from the gym. The story was framed as a cautionary tale about jealousy and mistrust. Experts discussed the psychological breakdown that jealousy can trigger, how emotional insecurity can turn into obsession, and how easily a test of love can spiral into destruction. Viewers were drawn to the haunting irony of it all. Emily had created a loyalty test to protect her marriage, only to destroy everything she was trying to save. A year after Emily's death, Sophie returned to the city once more, drawn by a strange need for closure. She visited the lake where Emily's body had been found. The water was calm that day, reflecting the gray sky above it. She stood at the edge for a long time, the sound of the wind whispering through the reeds. She held a small bouquet of white lilac and dropped them into the water. As the flowers drifted away, she whispered an apology that no one could hear. In her heart, she knew Emily's story would never really end. For Daniel, closure never came. One afternoon, while sorting through Emily's old belongings, he discovered a hidden compartment in her desk drawer. Inside was a small USB drive labeled Truth. His hands shook as he plugged it into his laptop. The drive contained audio recordings, Emily's voice, calm but trembling, speaking like she was confessing to herself. She described her fears, her suspicions, and her growing sense of being trapped. In one of the final recordings, she spoke directly about Sophie and the test. "She thinks I'm doing this to find peace," Emily's voice said softly. "But I'm doing it to see how much pain it takes before something breaks. Maybe I'm already broken. Maybe this is the only way to make them understand what betrayal feels like." The words froze Daniel in place. He listened through the rest of the recordings in silence, tears streaming down his face. Each one was darker than the last, showing how far she had fallen into her own despair. When he finished, he sat in the dark for hours, unable to move. The recordings were never made public. Daniel destroyed the USB drive the next day, throwing it into the same lake where she had died. He couldn't bear for anyone else to hear her pain, to turn it into another headline. But the sound of her voice stayed with him forever, a ghost that whispered from the edges of memory. Emily's story became one more file in the archives of tragic crimes, labeled and closed. But for those who lived through it, it was never truly over. It lingered in every sleepless night, every haunting dream, and every quiet moment when the past refused to stay buried. It was the story of how love turned to suspicion, how trust turned to madness, and how one woman's search for truth ended in silence at the bottom of a lake. Months turned into years, but the shadows of Emily Bennett's death never truly faded. Both Daniel and Sophie tried to rebuild their lives in silence, each haunted by memories they could neither escape nor confront. The city had moved on, the headlines had long vanished, and the case files sat untouched in a dusty cabinet deep within the police archives. But tragedy, as it often does, lingered beneath the surface, unseen but unforgotten. Daniel now lived in a quiet coastal town, far from the place where everything had collapsed. He worked at a small local gym, keeping to himself, avoiding conversations that went deeper than polite greetings. Every morning, he ran along the shoreline before dawn, as if trying to outrun the ghosts that followed him. Yet no matter how far he went, Emily's face followed, not the smiling woman he once knew, but the hollow-eyed reflection from the last time he saw her alive. He avoided relationships entirely. Every time someone showed even a hint of affection, he pulled away. Trust had become a foreign language. Love had turned into a memory too dangerous to revisit. There were days he wondered if Emily had cursed him, not with anger, but with guilt. He couldn't shake the feeling that she was still somewhere close, watching, waiting for him to admit something he didn't even understand himself. The more he tried to forget, the heavier the silence became. Sophie, on the other hand, had tried to turn her pain into something useful. She began studying psychology, driven by an obsession to understand how love, jealousy, and mental breakdowns intertwined. But even in classrooms and textbooks, she found Emily's shadow. Every case study about emotional manipulation, every lecture about obsessive thought patterns reminded her of the woman she had once called her best friend. Sometimes she dreamed of that final day, not as a victim but as a witness to a tragedy she couldn't prevent. One evening, while working on her thesis, Sophie received an anonymous email. The subject line simply read, "You still don't know the truth." Inside was a link to a cloud storage folder. Her hands trembled as she opened it. There were several files, photos, screenshots, and voice recordings. Some were clearly taken from Emily's phone, others from unknown sources. But one file caught Sophie's attention immediately, a short video dated the day before Emily's death. The video showed Emily sitting in her car at night, the dashboard lights dimly illuminating her pale face. She looked exhausted but calm, speaking softly as if confessing to herself. Her voice cracked as she said, "They think I'm testing loyalty, but I already know the answer. I just want to see who breaks first." Sophie's breath caught in her throat. Emily hadn't just wanted the truth. She wanted a reaction, a collapse, a confession that would make her feel in control again. The realization sank deep. Emily's plan was never about love. It was about power, about forcing others to experience the pain she carried inside. And maybe somewhere deep down, Emily knew it would end like this. Sophie immediately sent the files to the detective who had once handled the case, unable to keep them to herself. The email sparked a quiet reopening of the investigation, not as a criminal case but as a psychological analysis. Investigators tried to trace the origin of the email, but it came from a server in another country, untraceable. Someone out there had access to Emily's private recordings, someone who wanted Sophie to see them. Daniel was called in once more, reluctantly. When the detective played the same video for him, he sat motionless, his hands clenched tightly on the table. It was the first time he had seen Emily's face since destroying the USB drive years earlier. Her calm tone in the recording disturbed him more than her anger ever had. It was the quiet acceptance of someone who had already given up on life. After the video ended, Daniel stared at the screen for a long time before whispering to himself. She was already gone before any of us realized it. The new evidence didn't change the official conclusion, but it shifted the way the tragedy was remembered. The loyalty test had been just the surface, a cover for something far deeper. Emily had been unraveling for months, hiding behind normal routines and polite smiles, silently slipping away from reality. She hadn't been pushed by betrayal alone, but by loneliness and the belief that no one truly saw her pain. Sophie began writing about the case anonymously online, not as a confession but as a cautionary tale. She titled her article, "The Test That Went Too Far." It spread rapidly through social media, picked up by online communities fascinated by true crime psychology. Her writing didn't name anyone, but readers could feel the authenticity in every line. The sorrow, the regret, the lingering question of what might have changed if someone had noticed sooner. Daniel found the article one night by accident. He read it 3 times in silence. It didn't accuse him, nor did it absolve him. It simply told the truth, a truth he had spent years avoiding. He sent Sophie a short message afterward. "I read it." She would have wanted someone to understand her, even this late. She didn't reply. She didn't need to. Some wounds were beyond repair, and some silences spoke more than any apology could. Years passed. Daniel grew older, his hair turning gray, his eyes tired but calm. One afternoon, while walking near the lake where Emily had died, he stopped by the water's edge. The air was still, the reflection of clouds rippling on the surface. He dropped a single white rose into the water, watching it drift away. For the first time, he didn't feel fear or guilt, only a quiet sadness that felt almost peaceful. Sophie visited the same lake a year later, without knowing Daniel had been there before her. She too brought flowers, daisies this time, and stood in silence, eyes fixed on the horizon. The wind carried faint ripples across the water, as if the past itself was sighing through the trees. In that moment, she didn't think of the test, the betrayal, or even the death. She thought of the friendship that had existed before everything fell apart. The laughter, the plans, the moments that now felt like someone else's life. In the years that followed, both Daniel and Sophie moved on in their own quiet ways. They never saw each other again, but their paths remained connected by the same invisible thread, the memory of Emily Bennett. She became more than a person to them. She became a reminder of what jealousy and mistrust can do when they take root in love. Documentaries would continue to retell her story, each one offering a different angle, some focusing on the loyalty test, others on the emotional collapse that led to tragedy. But none could capture the haunting truth that those who lived through it knew, that sometimes the dead don't seek revenge or justice, they seek understanding. And so, the story of Emily Bennett faded from public conversation, but never from the hearts of those who carried it. The loyalty test she designed to prove devotion ended up proving something far darker, that once trust is broken, no test can repair it. It was a tale not of crime alone, but of the fragile, dangerous line between love and obsession. The lake remained calm, its waters carrying secrets only the wind could whisper. And somewhere beneath that surface, in the stillness of time and memory, the echoes of Emily's final confession seemed to linger, not as a cry for help, but as a silent warning to anyone who believes that love needs proof to be real.